We're 8 days into 2022. Statistically speaking, most people have already given up their New Year's resolutions, if they made them. And today I'm going to be talking about why your habits are failing you and what to do instead. I'm going to be covering a series of gems that I've learned from some of the best habit books. I'm going to be discussing how I've previously applied them to my own life and how I'd like to be able to help you in 2022, if not in person, then at the very least with this content. So the first thing I want to talk about is keeping yourself accountable. One of the reasons I'm putting this content out there is to keep myself accountable and to share both where I've gone wrong in the past and how I hope to put things right this year. Many times when people have approached me in the gym after doing something relatively impressive, such as deadlifting triple body weight or performing a human flag, they'll say, how do I build up towards doing that? And they're expecting me to give them sets and reps, or to tell them that you need this specific training program, which, you know, they're all very valid and justified, but they probably get a little bit pissed off when I say something like, turn up to the gym 3 to 4 times a week for the next 8 years. They don't seem to like that second part. And whilst it is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, it highlights, for me, two of the most important things. Firstly, show up. Secondly, keep going. Now again, I appreciate that's not very helpful, but this kind of advice is very applicable from Dan John's book, Now What? Now, I love Dan's sense of humour. It's one of the reasons why I've had him on the podcast, but there are some pearls of wisdom hidden beneath that dry sense of humour. In his book, Now What, he talks about the two different types of habits. Firstly, pirate maps, which are clear instructions or principles of how to achieve a goal. So if a habit is something that can be taken care of in one bite or one click of a button, as it were, then it's a shark habit. Something like responding to an email, yes, I'll be there at the wedding. These are shark habits. However, realistically, if you want to achieve high levels of performance, then you're going to need a principle-based approach. The word principle can be broken down from the root word primus, so meaning first. You'll see this in words such as primary school, prince, and the root word of scissors, or to decide, homicide, suicide. That sis or side comes from a root word which means to cut or to kill. So when we make a decision, we are effectively killing off or cutting off other options. One of the main reasons people fail at anything, myself included, is because they take on either too many things at once, or they'll try something, it didn't work in 2 weeks, and they're back to where they started. The first rule is, if you want to get really good at anything, then you need to stick at it. I know that's probably not news to many people, but I've got so many unfinished ideas, both on my Canva, which is the platform that I use for my social media posts, and the reason why, or something I want to get better at in 2022, is actually following through with an idea from start to finish and not getting distracted. I'll be talking a little bit more about that when I start reviewing the book, The One Thing. But for now, if it's a one-off habit, it's a shark habit. If it's something that involves being guided by principles, then we're talking about pirate maps. Anytime you're working with a coach who is worth their money, they will be taking a principle-based approach. They will not be going by the quote-unquote best exercise or best diet. They will be applying principles. And the difference between the two things there is that principles will always be what underpins the success. So if you look at any training program, the principles that are going to underpin the success are going to be stuff like progressive overload, stuff like frequency, stuff like specificity, how it relates to the task that you're going to do. They are not going to be underpinned by they all do the same exercises or they all advise the same foods. Diets work because of calorie deficit, but for example, if you're talking about something like a carb-only diet, for argument's sake, and you're giving that to somebody who is diabetic, for argument's sake, then that's not going to work. You need to be guided by the principles and the why, if you will, rather than the what. So another thing Dan discusses in his book is something that I think a lot of people miss, and this is the fact that when we're attempting to change behaviours, there's a continuum from the easiest types of behaviours to the hardest. Dan breaks these behaviours down as start, increase, decrease, and stop. Now, many people start on the hardest end of that spectrum, and that is the stop. The reason why habits are hard to break is typically because we've ingrained them over years and years and years. I can't remember whose quote it is, but a quote that I particularly like is, if you do it once, it's a mistake, do it twice, and it's a habit. Some of the most deleterious habits we have are so ingrained we don't even realise we're doing them. Whether it's scrolling through Instagram during a meeting, whether it's mindlessly smashing through a whole pack of chocolate digestives, stopping these behaviours is hard. But there are things that we can do to put a distance between us and these behaviours. Firstly, we can be a little bit kinder to ourselves, and we can start doing things. So, for example, most of us are experts on starting. In fact, I'm going to start fasting right now. There, I did it. As of now, I'm fasting. Continuing to fast might be difficult, but right now I'm fasting. So this is again why I've started a number of projects, and this is probably why they are still ongoing, because starting is the easiest. When you pick a new habit, you want to make sure that you can start it as easily as possible. So for example, if you're going to start walking, if you literally stand up and take a step, guess what? You've started walking. If you're going to start fasting, well, the second you stop eating, technically you're fasting. But in terms of fasting, this also brings us back to what I started with, and that is decision fatigue. Although fasting might not be appropriate for everyone in every situation, it does remove some of the decision fatigue as to what you're going to have to eat. Because if you're fasting, then guess what? For that time being, it's nothing. The next thing we're going to talk about is increasing. This is where a lot of people miss a trick, and where I've certainly had success since the start of the new year. Now, from the 26th of December, so Boxing Day in England, through to New Year, my partner and I spend this period of time off with her family. And in England, we have English tapas, or beige tapas, basically picky bits of food that have basically been cooked off, and it's not the healthiest, but after a week of gorging ourselves on that, we'd like to get back into some level of routine, both from a training perspective and from eating more healthily. Some people are stuck in this rut all year round though, and my advice to them would be, before you worry about decreasing or stopping entirely, let's just focus on increasing some of the good things that we are doing. So by getting more water, more lean protein, and more vegetables into our diet, we are probably going to remove or reduce the likelihood for cravings. A quote that I like so much from Dan John's book, Now What, that I'm going to choose to read it verbatim, highlights this principle perfectly. A woman once asked me if I knew a diet where she could eat anything you wanted. I said yes, but first she'd have to eat 2 pounds of salmon, 3 cups of oatmeal, a cup of blueberries, 2 bowls of mixed vegetables, and a carton of cottage cheese. After she finished that each day, she could eat anything she wanted. In summary, focus on the good foods, and the rest will probably take care of itself. You'll probably find that the majority of your cravings aren't because you desperately need whatever it is that item is. You're just either dehydrated, you are lacking fibre from vegetables, or that your food just isn't really that filling. Now we get on to decreasing. So starting is the easiest, increasing is easier. So if, for example, you don't just want to focus on those two, this is where we get into the nitty-gritty, as it were. So most of the things that we have to decrease tend to be mindless habits. So for example, something I was doing last year was tracking my social media usage through an app called Moment on my phone. And it's so easy, the second that you're bored, just to scroll through Instagram. You don't really know what you're searching for, but you're bored, so you're doing it anyway. The reason why that's so easy is because if you open your phone, chances are it takes you 5 seconds to get onto Instagram. What you need to do is put more distance between you and the habit. Now, you could go to greater extents, such as physically removing yourself from your phone, which I would definitely recommend. You could do a digital detox. However, some people might struggle with this because, for example, they might have to post on social media because of their job. They might have emails come through to their phone which supposedly they have to respond to there and then. But we've got to tackle these mindless habits. If we're talking about food, one of the easiest ways we can do this is to construct a menu and a shopping list. If we're talking about training or getting back into training, then we need to perhaps attack the other ends of the spectrum, which is starting and increasing. But we need to have a mindful approach rather than a mindless approach. When we're eating, stuff like counting 20 times 20 bites, as it were, can help you be more mindful. In terms of mindless, as I said, I'm as guilty as anyone for gorging an entire pack of chocolate digestives, but if they're not in the house in the first place, then that's very difficult to do. But like I said, decreasing, easier said than done, otherwise none of you would be listening to this podcast or reviewing this content. So we're going to move on to some other habits. Again, stopping is incredibly hard. Your brain is probably hardwired to, once you're hooked on a habit, is going to be hardwired to wanting to resume or continue with this habit. I do, however, love Dan John's advice when it comes to starting and stopping. So starting is hard. Stopping is hard. Not starting is easier. Empty your cupboards of all junk food. Never buy any ever again. You're welcome. So key take-homes from Dan John's book, Now What? You only have one can of free will. Use it wisely. Everything that is a negative drain on your life is going to potentially eat into your free will. Myself and my partner have seriously joked, we can use that as a paradox if you want, about not wanting children because it's going to be a drain on free will. If you have children, or if you have a stressful job, you'll probably know what it feels like to come home at the end of either looking after them or just a stressful day at work and then struggling to find the motivation to go to the gym. One of the reasons that prisoners are absolutely ripped, besides maybe some steroid use, is the fact that their meals are cooked for them. They get 1 hour a day of exercise, so all of that free will that's been bottled up can be effectively spent into their exercise. This is also one of the reasons why training first thing in the day is a great habit to get into if that fits your lifestyle, because you've not allowed other people to take from your free will, and as your free will starts to dry up more and more at the end of the day, it's far too easy to be like, I'm absolutely shattered, I'll start again tomorrow. The final thing is to promote and sustain positive behaviours before you restrict or eliminate negative ones. Myself personally, in terms of a diet perspective, just by getting in protein, vegetables and water, I find that my cravings for sweet things seem to miraculously disappear once I'm hitting these key metrics of increasing the good stuff. And to be honest, if you're having mostly good stuff, then the quote-unquote bad stuff, if there is such a thing, will take care of itself. The next book that I want to talk about is BJ Fogg's Tiny Habits. Now, what I like most about this book is it does what it says on the tin. Basically, the smaller you can make a habit, the more likely you are to pursue it and continue with it. Fogg presents his own behavior model where he says that behavior will happen when motivation, ability and prompt converge at the same moment. So realistically, you've got to think, what is it that's holding you back? Now, most people start in January quite motivated to perform an action. They're, for example, getting into a new training regime, a new diet regime. So the motivation is potentially quite high. However, the reality is it's not always going to stay high. I'll mention at later points during today's video and podcast that if I had to choose between discipline and motivation, I'm choosing discipline every single time. Discipline for me is going to be a byproduct of the environment that you create for yourself. It's going to be much easier to stay disciplined if your environment is, for example, free of temptation, or in BJ Fogg's formula, free of prompts or cues or triggers for certain behaviors, and motivation is like a wave. It will come and go. In January, you might be riding the crest of the wave, but 8 days later at time of recording, you might be struggling. The second thing is ability. So, for example, do you have the time to complete the task? Do you have the mental energy to do the task? If it's a creative task, so for example, since the turn of the year, I'm looking to get back into my video content, back into writing articles. If you're just hoping that sporadic bursts of motivation are going to see you through, then unfortunately you're going to come unstuck. And as I said, finally, you do need a prompt. It's one of those things that makes me realize how long I've been training for when I find it amusing that people can forget to go to a gym. It's like, in my head, I'm like, well, did you forget to brush your teeth? Most people don't, because one, they've been raised with the prompt or the cue from parents that you brush your teeth in the morning, you brush your teeth at night. So getting into bed might be the prompt for brushing the teeth in the morning, or being out just before you're about to leave the house might be the prompt for brushing the teeth in the morning. Another thing you can bring into play here is the concept of habit stacking. So this is where the prompt or the successful completion of one task acts as the prompt for the next task. So for example, dental hygiene is massively linked to the health and hygiene of other organs in the body. This is something Dan John talks about at length in his book, Now What? But if you're, for example, put off by the time it takes to floss all 30, however many teeth you've got, then something you can do is habit stacking. So whilst dentists might not agree on the order of this, after you've brushed your teeth, you can floss one tooth. Now, many people might think, well, what's the point? I might as well floss all of them. Or, for example, in January, they find, yep, they'll floss every single tooth every single day for 3 days straight. And then when they leave the house in a rush one morning, they forget. And all of a sudden, they've broken the streak 2 days in a row, and they go back to not flossing their teeth. So the comment or the advice that BJ Fogg gives in his book is make it so easy you can't say no to it. So I would say if the habit takes more than 10 seconds to do, then it's too big. Now, a lot of people scoff at my recommendation when they first start training at the gym, which is get yourself to the gym, do whatever the hell you want in there for 2 minutes, and then if you want to leave, then leave. And the whole trick they miss is that they think, 2 minutes is way too easy, I'll go for an hour. But when you say I'm going to go for an hour, all of a sudden you're requiring more motivation, more ability, and when those two things are lacking, then that's when the behavior is going to struggle to come to fruition. However, if you get yourself to the gym, you've already done the hard part. Some of the best lifting sessions I've had in my life have been because I didn't feel like training, but I've committed to the warm-up, and that's led on to the second habit, which would be, for example, the first set of whatever exercises I'm doing that day. So in order to push yourself above the activity line where motivation, your ability, and the prompt are converging, you can make the behavior tiny. You can make the prompt more obvious. So for example, setting reminders on your phone, or for example, committing to doing something with a friend. You can increase a person's skill. So for example, you need to know what your limiting factor is between you and a behavior. So if you don't know how to perform a certain lift, chances are you can't be bothered with the mental energy it might take to watch a few YouTube videos. So by hiring a coach, you're indirectly increasing your own skill. Equally, you might look to reduce the action or make the behavior tiny. You might look to pursue an exercise option that you already know how to do well, or that you feel comfortable in. Finally, you could look to change your context. So maybe you train with a friend, maybe you get somebody else to show you, maybe you improve the tools for the job. Anyone who has not used a paper shredder before and finds themselves having to disfigure documents by hand, even something like that is enough to put you off. One of the ways that you can improve your chances of succeeding with a behavior is by understanding what it is that makes that behavior hard to do. A quote from Tiny Habits is, what's making that behavior hard to do? I don't just mean very hard, I mean any amount of hard to do that would keep you from doing the behaviour. In the book, he gives a story of a woman who struggles with preparing her food just because, for example, she's cutting her vegetables with the wrong knife. Now, you've got a couple of options. Either A, you buy yourself a set of new knives. B, if you need to, you buy pre-cut vegetables. Now, if the aim is to eat more healthily, and the limiting factor is, for example, the time or the effort it takes to chop these vegetables up, then you're already one step closer to pushing yourself above the activity line. Something that I do with my evening routine to set myself up for the morning is I'll even go to the extent of filling the kettle. So when I'm making my morning coffee, it's just a flick of the switch rather than putting the kettle underneath the tap. I'll have cracked my eggs the night before. Now, I've heard some people say that this isn't particularly healthy. However, touch wood, I've not had any illnesses from this. And I'll even get the plates that I'm going to eat on and the knife and fork either side of the tray that I'll take through to sit down and eat. All of these little things mean that, for example, I'm not going to get put off by having to crack 5 eggs in the morning. I'm not going to find myself frustrated because, for example, I've cracked an egg, it's accidentally gone on the floor, and all of a sudden I'm regretting this decision entirely. So any little thing you can do that's going to reduce any amount of hard to do with that behavior is going to be beneficial. But you need to identify what your weakest link in the ability chain is. So when I look at applying this to my own life, stuff like the creative energy needed to write new blog posts or to come up with new video content ideas, I've mitigated this by batch constructing how my day is going to look. So for example, there'll be certain points of my day where I'm like, right, this is going to be a blog writing section. This is going to be a video writing section. At the start of 2022, I wrote one of my first blogs, Future-Proofing Youth Athletes, and honestly, it must have taken me a good 10 to 15 minutes to try and remember how to coordinate different parts of my website, and even simple things like how do I add a picture to a blog, how do I hyperlink off of the blog. However, once I was in my flow and I remembered how to do it, it's very easy to start drafting blogs on top of that. Equally, stuff like creativity. If you're trying to do something that's creative, maybe you've got a side hustle going on, you're going to need to protect that creativity. Now, different people will find that they feel more creative at different times of the day. Sometimes you might not be able to block your creative tasks for when you're actually feeling it. So you need to protect that creativity by ensuring you've got enough sleep, by ensuring you're able to transition between what Barbara Oakley describes as diffuse mode and focus mode. So if you imagine your brain working like a dimmer switch, the diffuse mode is when you're turning that dimmer switch down. Focus mode would be as if you're underneath a stage light. Your brain is not designed to work in focus mode all the time. So focus mode is when you are deliberately thinking about specific problems. Your diffuse mode is effectively when you're putting your brain on the back burner, so to speak. And this is why so many people get brilliant ideas for certain things, either when they're in the shower because they're not distracted by specific things, or they're not specifically thinking on a task, or while they wake up with brilliant ideas. I could be misquoting this, but I'm pretty sure that I read somewhere that Einstein discovered or had the first, Thomas Edison had the first idea for the light bulb, or Einstein had the idea about gravity. When he had fallen asleep, he had these metal balls that he would fall asleep, and when he just about drifted off into sleep, his hand would release the metal balls, hit the floor, and that would wake him up. But if you're not looking at what your weakest link in the chain is, then you're leaving a lot of performance on the table. So the key take-homes from BJ Fogg's book, Tiny Habits. When motivation, ability, and a prompt converge at the appropriate moment, this is when you are going to see behavior result. You need to make the behavior as small as you possibly can so that you're minimizing the level of motivation needed. As I said, first week of January, everyone's motivation is soaring, but for example, if you're new to training and then you're going to say to yourself, right, I'm going to need to get to the gym for an hour, the second you're feeling a little bit groggy, an hour feels like a very long time indeed. So you need to reduce the strain in the weakest link of your ability chain. So if it's a time perspective, is there a way that you can, for example, organize your day so that the fiddly things become more second nature? So for example, when I first started writing my blogs again this year, having to remind myself how to do certain things took a little bit of time, but once I was in my flow and I could remember, it was very easy to start knocking up drafts of different blogs. With video content, the same. And this is why you're going to need to section off your time by task rather than just manually deciding that today is going to be a productive day. The next book I want to review is Gary Keller's The One Thing. Now I know for a fact I'm not going to be able to do this book justice, but this is easily in my top 3 books that I have found the most useful from a productivity perspective. I'd also highly recommend Gary Keller's podcast with Tim Ferriss. If you read Gary Keller's book, you'll understand that he doesn't really do public awards or public invitations. In fact, in his book, I think he mentioned that he'd won this well-renowned property award for being one of the, I think, most successful estate agents in America, and he sent his PA along to receive the award. Anything that distracts from the one thing is nothing more than a distraction. So like Gary Keller says in his book, be like a postage stamp. Stick to one thing until you get there. The main thing from Gary Keller's book is what he calls the focusing question, and that is this: what is the one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else becomes easier or unnecessary? Now, on the surface of this, you might not appreciate how skilled a question this is, but let's break it down. So it starts with, what is the one thing I can do? So whenever you've got a task, inevitably there will be a to-do list as long as your arm as to all of the things that go into that task. So for example, at the moment I'm working on a mobility package that is designed to help people improve their science or their scientific knowledge of mobility restrictions, what they can do to alleviate them, and also provide sample routines both based on sport and based on problem areas. Now, this book has been months, if not years, in the making, and my one thing for that, and by way of keeping myself accountable, is to get the videos done for that book. The reason why it's my one thing is because being able to film myself talking through exercises is something that I can do. I've got the technical expertise, although anyone who's seen some of my YouTube videos might disagree with me there, and it's something that's actually within my power to do. So it has to be one thing, it has to be something you can actually do. There's no point talking in hypotheticals, as my missus likes to remind me, and this should make the subsequent tasks easier or unnecessary. So for example, with my mobility package, once I've got the videos done, the only thing that I need to do is to sharpen up the visuals of the PDF, which in comparison is not going to take anywhere near as long as it will do to record, edit, and publish the videos. Secondly, once I've got those library of videos, that'll also make it easier for other subsequent tasks, such as the promotion of the mobility book, because I'll already have the content. In the book, Gary reveals, and I find this fascinating, that a domino has, if it's correctly placed, can knock over another domino that is 25% bigger than it. He also gives some crazy statistics about how many dominoes would be needed to knock over the Leaning Tower of Pisa or the Eiffel Tower. I forget which one now. But if you do the maths, it works, and you think all of that started from one little domino. So if you're correctly aligning your tasks, then it's going to be like a chain reaction, whereby the completion of one task will kickstart or make easier the next task on the list. So it's not necessarily about having a to-do list, it's about how you organize that to-do list. Gary also breaks this down in terms of how he goes from a 5-year goal or a someday goal into what do you do today. So you take that focusing question. So for example, what is it that I would like to do someday? And then you ask yourself, what is one thing I can do such that by doing it, everything else related to my someday goal will become easier or unnecessary. And then you repeat that question by replacing someday with 5 years, 5 years with 1 year, a year to, for example, a month to a week to a day, and then you end up with what is the one thing I can do today such that by doing it, everything else related to that task or that goal becomes easier or unnecessary. Now, the reason why I share this extract is because the amount of times I get sidetracked, and I'm sure a lot of people do, by doing something, but it wasn't my one thing. So if your one thing didn't make subsequent tasks easier or unnecessary, it wasn't your one thing. So for example, whilst I can and I do find it easy to get distracted by working on the visuals of my up and coming mobility book, that doesn't make it easier to complete. And it's very easy for me to get obsessed with, for example, how a picture's aligned or whether the edges are smoothed off, when in reality that's not lining up the next subsequent task. Once I've got all the videos filmed for this mobility package, then it'll be much easier to create the visuals around it. So key take-homes of the one thing. By focusing on your one thing, subsequent tasks become easier or unnecessary. That means when you align your tasks appropriately, this is going to lead to a domino effect, and this is going to set. So key take-homes of the one thing. By focusing on your one thing, subsequent tasks become easier or unnecessary. That means when you align your tasks appropriately, this is going to lead to a domino effect, and this is going to set up the success of the next task. So by focusing on your one thing, you are allowing yourself to be more productive. Now we get to what I call the big daddy of habit books. Atomic Habits is a book that I think could easily justify having a chapter review of each and every chapter. And I'd love the opportunity to speak to James Clear on the podcast one day. So firstly, he presents the habit cycle. Although this isn't necessarily anything new in terms of habits, I do like the way that he explains how you can break the habit cycle of destructive habits, or how you can increase the chances of this habit cycle looping round for positive habits. So firstly, you're going to have something that causes you or triggers the brain to initiate a behavior. So this might be, for example, walking past the bakery and smelling freshly baked bread. This might be seeing a little notification that someone sent you a message on Instagram. Either way, without a cue, we don't get a behavior. Much like BJ Fogg's book said that we need a prompt for a behavior, a cue, a trigger. These are all different words for the same thing. So this cue creates a craving, which leads us to act. So for example, you've smelt the freshly baked bread. You're now thinking, would quite like to buy myself a baguette right about now. So the response is going to be the action that one performs, so the habit, and this is going to lead to some level of reward. Now, although this is getting out of my lane a little bit here, for negative behaviors, so for example self-harm, the adrenaline rush from harming yourself, there is still going to be a reward for that. So even negative behaviors, so for example people who are heavily overweight, the dopamine hit of, for example, a sugary substance or a fattening substance, there's still going to be a reward there. But what we can do is try and manipulate this cycle to either set up future habit cycles of positive behaviors. So we've already talked about habit stacking, whereby the end of one habit becomes a new one. So something that myself and my partner are doing this year is on weekends, when we're sitting down to our morning cup of coffee, we'll then write one thing we're grateful for and one highlight of the week. We always sit down to have that cup of coffee together on the weekends, so we've already got a predetermined behavior that we're stacking a new habit onto. So how do we promote good habits? James Clear gives 4 things that we can do in order to do this. Interestingly, we can also reverse this if we want to dissuade ourselves from bad habits. So the first one is make it obvious. So the reason why you spend more time on your phone than reading a book is because your phone is to hand and chances are your book is on a shelf somewhere at home. So make it obvious. If you've got a fruit bowl in your room, in your front room, versus say a snack box of chocolates, whichever is there, whichever is obviously in front of you and easy to reach, is going to be probably what you default to. Now, James Clear jokes about keeping the TV remote in a loft with a rope attached rather than a stepladder if you want to watch TV, because that way, if you want to watch something on TV, you will go to the effort of climbing the rope to get in the loft to grab the remote. However, if you're just putting it on because it's there, it's probably going to be enough distance to stop you doing that. The second thing is make it attractive. So the reason why habit trackers work is because they build up some kind of response. Everyone loves ticking stuff off their to-do list, which is why we often end up in a situation where we prioritize relatively meaningless things in the grand scheme of things, because we're going to get that dopamine hit from scratching it off our to-do list. But habit trackers do work. This is why Fitbit and other technologies like you to build up a streak, and this is why people build up insane streaks on stuff like Snapchat, despite the fact that in the grand scheme of things, again, relatively meaningless. If you make the habit attractive, you're much more likely to do it. That might be, for example, listening to a podcast while you do the washing up, or having your own Gym Jams playlist when you train. If you can make it more attractive, you're more likely to do it. Thirdly, make it easy. If you commit to 2 minutes a day in the gym, you're much more likely to have the motivation to do it because the ability needed to do it is so low. If you make it hard and tell yourself you're not going to the gym unless you run a marathon on the treadmill, again, the second you feel groggy, you're going to struggle. Finally, make it satisfying. I can't believe I'm saying this, but when people say to me, what's the best exercise for insert said goal? And they're like, oh, I really love training with weights, so I can't stand running. Do you think I should do running? I'm like, no, of course not, because you're obviously not going to stick to it. Even if it was superior, which it may or may not be, you're not going to stick to it. So we can reverse these behaviors to make, we can reverse these parts of the habit cycle to make something less likely to happen. So make it obvious. I have tried to commit to having more fruit in my fruit bowl. I've tried to make it attractive. So for example, having it with yogurt or breaking up a cereal bar into it. In terms of making it easy, smoothies, I found a much easier way of basically getting more fruit into my diet. And in terms of vegetables, if it's something like using a slow cooker or chili con carne, it's very easy just to chuck something in. So for example, if I've cracked my eggs in the morning and it's just a case of chucking some baby spinach leaves in, that required no effort on my part, just opening a bag. And in terms of making it satisfying, checklist habit trackers, one way of doing it, and even simple things like, for example, I've managed to get some cleaning spray that smells of Parma violets. Again, not a massive effort on my part, but all of a sudden tasks that I'm not so keen on, such as wiping down surfaces, all of a sudden become that little bit more attractive. The final thing James Clear talks about, which I think is incredibly important and underrated, is what he calls the inside-out approach. So in order to really change behavior, you need to change it at the level of your identity. And the reason why this is important is because when you identify strongly with something, that will dictate your behavior, because your identity is what makes the decision for you. So for example, myself, I don't drink, and whilst there might be a number of reasons that I choose not to, one of them partly my training, but the reality is it just doesn't appeal to me. But people who know me know that I don't drink, and therefore they know there's no point in offering me one because I'm not going to take it. But this is a more powerful way of looking at things versus saying I can't drink. So if you say I can't have this, all of a sudden you're putting that restriction on yourself. You are focusing on the behavior, i.e. not drinking, rather than your identity. So if you're looking to become successful in holding down a training program, you need to be the type of person who doesn't miss training or doesn't miss your workouts. In order to do that, this is why we lower the bar. We lower the bar to 2 minutes to let us achieve that consistency streak and let us feel good about ourselves. James Clear mentions about never missing twice. So if we miss training, or we miss, for example, eating healthily, we get back on it straight away. This is also why lowering the bar to success is actually key to building up the consistency. The trick that people miss is they think, 2 minutes in the gym, what's the point? That's not going to do anything. Well, if you ran for 2 minutes as hard as you possibly could, anyone who's ever trained for the 400 meters or the 800 meters knows that that will leave you feeling absolutely wrecked for the rest of the day. But people seem to think, what's the point? 2 minutes, not going to do anything. 2 minutes done consistently, however, definitely will do. So if you're looking to change your behavior, you need to start with your identity. Another interesting thing that I found from a podcast of Greg McKeown's, where he spoke to Tim Ferriss, was that the brain doesn't really deal well with wishy-washy instructions. So he says, look for the one decision that's going to eliminate hundreds of other decisions. So me not drinking, that then eliminates any decision as to whether, for example, I'm going to go and drink at this social event, or whether I'm going to have this or that. Yes, I might still go, but I'm not going to drink, because that one decision has made the rest of the decisions for me. You might not necessarily live that way, and that's absolutely fine. But if you want to change your identity, that is what is then going to help you achieve your outcomes. You need set the bar so low that you can't possibly say no, gain consistency, and then once you've got that habit dialed in, then you can talk about refining it. Dan John makes a point of saying that he refuses to program for athletes who don't floss their teeth. The reason being, firstly, if your dental hygiene is poor, then it leaves you at increased risk of other things which are going to derail your training, such as heart health issues or gut issues. But secondly, if you can't commit to something that takes 2 minutes a day, what makes you think that you can commit to 12 weeks of arduous training? So my key take homes for today's podcast. Your environment and your routine will always trump your motivation. Motivation comes and goes in waves. There's some days where I don't feel like training at all, but the reality is it's become such a part of my routine and such a part of my identity that often trumps any decision in terms of wanting to miss the gym. I tell myself on a bad day, look, I'll get there, I'll do a warm-up, and then I'll go from there. The reality is, if I've done the hard part in getting to the gym, I know that the fact I've got a routine, i.e. a training program, is going to be what trumps the next thing. And in terms of habit stacking, once I've done my warm-up, which is an established habit, then I will do my first exercise. Once I've done the first one, move on to the second one, etc., etc. Secondly, start smaller than you think you need to. So for example, with myself, anyone who knows me knows that whilst I'm lucky enough not to necessarily look the way that my diet looks, the reality is, for me, I am not the biggest fan of fruit and vegetables, believe it or not, but by starting smaller than I need to, i.e. just shoving a handful of baby spinach in with my scrambled eggs, it's going to help me become more consistent. It requires no effort on my part. I open the bag, I chuck it in with the scrambled eggs. I'm adding it to a habit that is already well established. I've got a cue or a prompt. I've got the ability to just open a bag of baby spinach and chuck it in there, and I've got the motivation because I do want to eat more healthily. So if you would like to work with myself in 2022, or you'd simply like someone to help keep you accountable, then you can reach out to me, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Todd Davidson, P2P Coaching. If you'd like a program to get you started, then you can access this via my Patreon, where I release exclusive video content, programs, educational strength and conditioning work. You can find that by searching for Todd Davidson P2P Coaching on Patreon. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you again in the next episode.